All right. Yeah, smaller group today, but that might be because of the time change. So, I'll send this recording out to everybody. Um, yeah, so hi everybody. I'm Elena, the district manager at the Stratford County Conservation District, and this is our second seed saving workshop. And we have Hannah here to talk to us today. So um, feel free to type questions into the chat, and we'll talk at the end about any questions you guys have. And yeah, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Hannah.
Thank you so much, Elena, and thank you to those of you who are able to make the time shift and join us in this afternoon. I really appreciate it. Um, I I am not going to monitor the chat, but if people have questions, and Elena, if any questions look pertinent, I do not mind stopping to answer questions as they come up. I just am not really monitoring Zoom the way I normally would. So,
Sure.
um, so today we are going to dive in to some of the planning that should really go behind saving seed. We did our introductions last time, but I'll skip past the slide. And like I said, if anyone has questions as we go along, feel free to ask them. Also, in the July and August workshops, a lot of the things we go over today we'll be reinforcing during those workshops. And so if something feels really fuzzy now, it will become clearer as we make those additional passes and when we gather together in the fall at the in-person workshops. So whenever I get started on a project, I like to really think about why I'm doing this. And in thinking about that, it helps me start to frame what are my goals. And there's a number of considerations to take for working with the plants that you plan to save seed from. So having a set of goals ahead of time and writing them down really helps you with the planning. And I just want to underscore that the amount of planning that you can put into preparing for saving seeds will really pay for itself in spades at the end of your seed saving project. So last time Bill went over a lot of really great um, reasons to save seeds. And, those include the need for bioregionally adapted plant varieties, um, lack of biodiversity and proprietary control of seed sources by multinational national corporations, and, just curiosity. It can be very expensive to buy seeds, and so saving seeds can save you money. But this is really a question just to ask yourself, what are the reasons that you want to save seeds? And that is going to help guide how you approach saving seeds. And the information that I'm going to present is really assuming that you are um you really want robust, genetically stable seeds, and that you're going to be undergoing a fairly intensive approach to your seed saving. And I do that because maybe some of you actually do want to go that far. But certainly if your reasons for saving seed is just so you can have the seeds for your personal use year after year, you don't need to go crazy with planning. But think about why you want to save seeds, and part of that is what is your intended end use for those seeds. Like I said, are you just planning to use them yourself? Are you sharing with friends and family? Are you sharing with your broader community? Are you planning to sell these seeds? Are you selling these seeds to a seed company? Or are you really diving into preserving a very special variety? And those are all different levels of seed saving, and the intensity to which you pay attention to keeping that seed as pure and true to type as possible really falls along that spectrum. And I think also getting started, Bill touched on this a little bit last time, and I just can't stress how important it is to pick a crop that you really love or something that you have a really strong connection to. If you're a farmer, maybe it's a super important crop for your whole financial plan for the year. And so just pick something that a crop that's important to you because you will put a lot of effort into preparing for saving those seeds, and you'll have a lot of success. And when you have a lot of success, you're going to find diving into other seed saving projects a lot easier to do. And what we really want is to get as many people saving seeds at all of these levels. And so we want you to have as much success as possible. So once you've picked a crop, there are a few key pieces of information that you are really going to want to know about that crop. So, and I usually start a few pages in one of my notebooks to capture all of this information. So one is the life cycle. And last time we learned that life cycle refers to whether it's an annual, is it a perennial, is it a biennial? That's the life cycle. And that matters because that is going to help you plan for growing that crop. If it's an annual, you're going to expect that the crop will complete its life cycle and you will have seeds to save by the end of the year. If it's a biennial, that crop is not going to give you seeds until the end of the second year growing it. And so you want to be prepared for growing that plant as robustly as possible, giving it as much support as you can in that first year so that it has a great big huge root and lots of energy to make seed the following year. But then you also have to make sure that you have taken into account, I need to store this for the winter. And am I going to store this by just leaving it in the ground and letting it overwinter in the ground? And what do I have to do to protect it to get it through the winter that way? Am I going to harvest these roots and bring them inside into a root cellar or a basement? Or, how am I going to plan to protect these roots? And then if it's a perennial, you just want to know what you're getting into with the life cycle of the plant. And then you want to know, what is this plant's mating strategy? And this is a concept that we will definitely be exploring more in July and August workshops. I am going to go over it a little bit more in depth here today. Last week, Bill mentioned crossers versus selfers, and I put here, or is it somewhere in between? Because as we know, the only rule in nature is that all rules are usually broken and nothing is really exactly as you expect it's going to be. So let's take a quick look at self-pollinating plants or selfers. And this is something where pollination and fertilization typically happen before the flower fully opens. And so that means that the pollen and the eggs get together and we have fertilization and the formation of a little baby embryonic plant before the flowers fully open and insects and bees and wind or whatever's carrying that pollen around can get into the flower. Now, I think that many of us have probably observed our peas and our beans growing and seen bees on those flowers before the flowers are even open. And bees their legs can poke into the flower and pick up pollen and be carried to the next plant. And so when we say sulfurs or crossers or somewhere in between, you want to understand how pollination and fertilization happen and the role that insects play in moving things around in your garden unexpectedly. So then we have plants that are considered self-pollinating. I think one of the most traditional thoughts about tomatoes is they're self-pollinating, but they actually are highly capable of cross-pollinating with another plant. And if you're not really expecting that that can happen, that can really lead to some surprises when you save seeds. And so I have two pictures here, side by side, of tomato flowers from different tomato plants. And if you look really, really carefully, the picture on the left, if you look at, there's a little orange cone protruding out of the bottom of that flower, and those are the anthers. And if you look just beyond that, there's a little green disc hanging out just outside of those anthers. That's the tip of the female portion of the flower that receives pollen. And here you see it's exposed to the outdoor elements. And that means a passing bee that is carrying pollen can easily pollinate that flower. And in that case, that flower would be a cross-pollinating flower. And the flower on the left, the anther cone, which appears a little bit more yellow than orange, you can see it's completely fused together and there's no little green disc hanging out at the bottom of that flower. So that plant is a lot more reliably self-pollinating. And I go into this in a lot of depth in the botany lecture that is on the Freed Seed Federation website. And I know Elena sent you all the links to those videos as supporting reference material for this workshop series. And so you can find a more in-depth explanation of that there. Okay. And so then we have mating systems where we have plants who are far more reliably need to outcross, and that means that they pollinate their flowers with the pollen from other plants, not the plant that the female portion of the flower is located on. And these plants are generally plants where inbreeding can be devastating to the progeny of any fertilization and seed creation event. And so they have these pretty complex mechanisms to help with cross-pollination. And when you look at some of these flowers, when they are blooming, you'll see the flowers producing pollen at the same time that the flower looks open. And this concept called protandry is where the pollen actually matures at a different time than the egg-bearing part of the plant matures. And in that way, the pollen is not able to pollinate the flowers that the pollen was produced from. And then on the right-hand side, that's a brassica flower, and self-incompatible means that the pollen-bearing part of the plant and the egg-bearing part of the plant are mature at the same time, but they don't chemically recognize each other. So the pollen could fall on the egg-bearing portion of the plant, and you still would not get pollination. Other strategies for plants that require crossing is to actually have separate egg bearing and separate pollen bearing flowers. Um, and these flowers can be located on the same plant, as in the example of your squash plants. You'll see the flowers that have these ovaries on the bottom. This is an egg-bearing flower. Sometimes people refer to this as the female flower. We are trying to shift the language that we use about flowers and plants and not anthropomorphize as much. So I try to stick with egg bearing and pollen bearing. Um, and then for the squash plants, this flower on the right-hand side, you will see this does not have a little ovary at the bottom, and that is the pollen-bearing flower. And right beside it is an egg-bearing flower on the left, and you can see that this is a patty pan squash, and you can see the little tiny patty pan shaped ovary. And finally, another mechanism that plants that really need to have cross-pollination, that are really, really sensitive to any sort of inbreeding depression, they actually separate the pollen-bearing flowers from the egg-bearing flowers into two separate plants. So this is an these are up-close pictures of spinach. And on the left, those very pretty, silky, white little filaments, those are the egg-bearing flowers of the spinach plant. And on the right, you have these fuzzy, yellowish little flowers, and those are the pollen-bearing parts of the plant. And so, in addition to knowing the mating system that your crop employs, which is any one of these strategies, you also then, if you, Bill touched on the concept of population size a little bit last week, and all of this is to help prevent inbreeding depression and a genetic bottlenecking in the integrity of the seed that you're trying to save. And so, in addition to mating systems, you need to know how many plants that you should be trying to save seed from in order to prevent inbreeding depression. And I'll talk about that for a second before I move on to isolation distance. So, last time Bill gave an example of beans as a plant that reliably self-pollinates. And if you really only had room to grow one bean plant, you could probably get away with saving seed from that for a while, and each year planting the resulting seed from just one plant. And you'd probably have a bean that is fairly healthy each year. But it is, and that's fine. If you're saving seed for personal use or maybe just sharing with friends and family, that's fine. But if you really want, and let's remember also that a variety is actually a population of plants. And so if you really want a stronger variety, you want a little more genetic diversity in that variety. And so even for something as reliably self-pollinating as a bean plant, it's better to save seed from 5 different plants, or maybe even 10 different plants if you have the room to grow them. Certainly for plants that are crossers, and you'll see on the right-hand side of this chart at the bottom of the slide, you want to plant 500, I'm sorry, 50 plants or sometimes even 200 plants, and save seed from all of those plants together to have a really robust genetic diversity in the seed that you're saving. And in the middle, you see things like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants. And here we recommend that you're planning to save seed from 20 plants or even 50 plants. If tomatoes are capable of cross-pollinating, peppers and eggplant actually cross-pollinate to a higher degree. And so if you're growing different varieties of tomato and pepper and eggplant, there's a risk that you do have some cross-pollination in there between varieties. And so you want to actually save seed from more plants. And then the other concept that we just touched on last time is isolation distance. And that is simply the distance between the plants you want to save seed from and other plants that might be within that crop type but are of a different variety. So, for example, if you're trying to save seed from a Brandywine tomato, but you also want to grow 10 other varieties of tomato, like Cherokee Purple and Granadero paste tomato, et cetera, you would want to group your Brandywine tomatoes that you're trying to save seed from. Maybe you plant 20 of them, and you are going to plant those in one part of your garden. And the rest of the tomatoes you want to keep about 30 to 50 feet away from the group of Brandywines that you want to save seed from. And this information is exists for every type of crop that you want to grow. Later on in this presentation, I have a list of 3 really important books that I use all the time. So if you're interested in growing and saving seed from, uh, spinach plants, you can look up in any one of these 3 books that I'm going to make sure you all have a link to, and look up how many plants do I need to grow in order to have robust, genetically um, uh, robust seed, and how far away do I need to keep the group of plants I'm saving seed from other crops that I'm growing that are of the same crop type. Okay, and then after we understand mating strategies, we also want to know what is the pollination mechanism. And this can help us plan if it's a wind pollinated plant that really bears heavily upon how you're going to position that plant in your garden or on your homestead or in your farm, in order to prevent it from cross-pollinating with another type of plant. So pollen can be moved around by insects. It can be moved around by wind. It can be moved around by butterflies, hummingbirds, bats, um, all sorts of different ways that pollen gets moved around. And just quickly, I know I mentioned earlier pollination and fertilization. Pollination is simply the movement of pollen from one flower to another. Fertilization actually happens deep down inside of the egg-bearing plant, where the sperm that's carried by the pollen is delivered to the ovary of the plant and finds the egg cell. And again, that's in my botany lecture, and I don't want to go too deep into that. So the other thing that you want to make note of is when can you expect that seed to be mature? Is it a really fast growing plant? I don't know. I want to say all of us have probably I do this every year. I'm hopeful that I can plant cilantro and finally get to harvest cilantro leaves sometime in the spring, but that doesn't happen because it goes to blooming very, very quickly. And if you plant cilantro later in the summer, it will stay leafy green and won't go to flowering. So it just depends on the time of year you can expect seed maturity. So is it in the spring? Is it in the summer? Is it in the fall? And when you're considering, is it a biennial, then it's going to be the following year. But what time of year is that going to happen? And this is important to know so that you're prepared for it. Certain crops, when you're working with, really require pretty quick action once the seed starts to ripen. And so you want to make sure you have the equipment on hand that you're going to need in order to harvest that seed, to process that seed, and to store that seed. And we'll go through that specific type of equipment in subsequent lectures, but just know you want to have an idea of when to expect that seed to be ready to be harvested. And then you want to know, what type of seed am I dealing with? Bill talked a little bit last time about wet or dry seeded crops. I'll give you a little bit more information here, but the July and August workshops are going to focus, one of the workshops will focus entirely on wet seeded crops, and the other lecture will focus entirely on dry seeded crops. So I'll give you a little bit more of a definition of what these are, but we'll get into it in a lot more depth later this summer. So when you have a plant whose seed dispersal mechanism is through the fruit or the seed pod drying down, that's what we refer to as a dry seeded crop. So a really good example of this are your beans. If you are going to eat your beans, especially like green beans or shelling beans, you're actually going to harvest that fruit to eat before that seed is actually mature and viable. And that means that, to get really truly viable seed out of a bean plant, you have to let that bean pod fully develop and grow and grow and grow. And later in the summer, you'll see those bean pods start to dry, and they'll eventually get so dry that they will split open. And that is when that seed is ripe. And then you have other examples are dill seeds. Those are actually what you think is a seed is actually the fruit, and inside is a tiny seed. But these seeds just stay dry on the plant and eventually fall off of the plant in storms or when animals brush by it. Um, Other types of dry seeded crops uh, form these little structures that float around on the wind. So this is a picture of a dandelion seed on the left, but it is also how lettuce disperses its seed. And then some seed pods actually, instead of just splitting open when they're fully mature, they actually split open violently and eject the seed several feet away from the parent plant. So these are some of the different types of dry seeded crops. And then the wet seeded crops, far more obvious what we mean by that. Tomatoes are the perfect example of that, and we will get a lot more in depth with when we do the wet seeded crop lecture. So once you get to know your crop and you have your information and you know what to expect, now you want to actually set a few goals for yourself. And this comes back to why are you planning to save seed? So oftentimes I work with people and I work with a lot of farmers, and a lot of homesteaders who are really trying to improve a variety. They like a certain variety, but it could be a little bit better. So you want to figure out, is your goal just simply to preserve an existing variety as it is, and you don't want or need to make any changes to that? You just want to improve it. You just want to preserve it. Are you trying to, or are you trying to improve an existing variety? Maybe you love Cherokee Purple, but you don't love that it is susceptible to every disease out there. And so you want to try to save seeds and improve the disease resistance of the plant. Or maybe you want to create all new traits. You like what one variety of, let's take beets for example. Maybe you like um how Shiraz beets taste and the beet itself, but you like how this other beet variety, Feuerkugel, maybe you like how the greens taste there, and maybe you have a third variety of beets, maybe it's Boro, and you like how well they store for the winter. And so none of those three beets are really perfect, but maybe combining them and creating a whole new set of traits could give you the beet that you really want. And so you want to know what your goal is in saving seeds in that manner as well. And I just want to touch on the concept of a variety versus a strain. And someone asked a question last time um about varieties, and it made me think that maybe I could try to offer a little more insight here as to um just to get your brains churning on this information. So a variety is just um, different types within a same crop. So tomato, you have your Brandywine, Granadero, Cherokee Purple, Prudence Purple. All of those are different varieties, and they all have a different set of characteristics. Um, and it's pretty easy to see what those are. And I want to introduce this concept of a strain, though, because within each variety, there exists several strains. And Bill touched on this a little bit last time, where he was saying, Cherokee Purple, you could be saving seeds from Cherokee Purple tomatoes in Maine, in Florida, in Colorado, and you can save seeds from plants that give you that Cherokee Purple tomato and preserve that fruit quality type. But those plants are going to be very, very different if the seeds have been saved for those plants in those very different regions. And that represents different strains. And that can be important when you're buying seeds from a seed company. Seeds are produced all over the world for all these different types of varieties. And so it's important to think when you're starting to seed save, how how does this variety perform here? And I've done trials before just looking at seed from the exact same variety, but getting it from several different sources, like, 10 or 12 different seed companies. Maybe I got some at a seed swap, and planting all of those different strains of the same variety side by side and looking at the differences. And this is important when you're thinking in your head, you know what, I actually want to breed my own variety, or I really want to adapt and improve this existing variety. You might want to actually start looking at different strains and letting those strains cross-pollinate and sussing that out in a breeding project. I'm not going to go too much further with that, but I just wanted to add a little more context on what we mean when we're talking about varieties, and you will also hear us talking about different strains. So, you've picked your crop, and now what? So, do you know which variety you want to work with? And you know, the latter half of this talk today is actually going to be about doing variety trials. And you will know all about them by the end of the talk. And if you have already figured out exactly what variety you want to work with, do you know which strains of that variety you want to work with? In all of these questions, if you don't know the answer to either of these questions, these can be answered by doing some variety trials. So, Elena, before I move on, are there any questions that have come up yet?
Nope, not yet. Does anybody have any questions? I guess we're good.
Okay. All right. So, conducting variety trials. Um, so I present this information because when you're saving seeds in general, it does take a certain level of observing your plants and in all of the planning considerations I just talked about, you should be churning in your mind, what is it that I like? What is it about this crop I want and that I want to grow again? And that is, that's the overall goal. And but how do you systematically determine whether or not the plants you're growing are actually exhibiting those traits that you really desire? And so, variety trials, I've been doing variety trials since I was little. My mom was a back to the lander in Maine, and she grew variety trials for Johnny selected seeds. And so we were always growing, instead of one type of spinach, it was 7 different types of spinach and evaluating these plants. And then we would figure out which varieties of spinach we wanted to keep growing. Um, so what are variety trials? It's essentially research, and I don't want that to scare anyone. It can be as complex or simple as you really want to make it. It could simply entail planting Brandywine tomatoes, maybe plant 10 of them, maybe plant 20 of them, and by the end of the season, you say, this plant had the prettiest, most tasty fruit, and that's what I'm going to save seed from. So, variety trial could be that simple. I would recommend putting a little more into it than that, but it can be very simple. There are several different types of trials that you can do, and these can happen at research stations. You guys are all really close to University of New Hampshire, which is where I got my degree in plant physiology, and I was involved in a lot of variety trials and plant breeding projects. I worked for Dr. Davis in the strawberry breeding program, and I also worked for a couple of other researchers there. So research stations conduct variety trials and plant research all the time. You can easily do these on your farm, at your home, in your homestead. You can also do these collaboratively. And Bill gave a really nice example of a community corn seed saving where each member that have parties at a holiday time, and there would be 2 bowls by the door where one person would come in and they were all trying to grow the same type of corn. And when you would go and visit each other's homes at the holidays, you'd bring seed from your farm and you would leave that seed in a small bowl, and then you would take a pinch of seed from another bowl where everyone else had. And in that way, collaboratively within a network, within a community, you can save seed from a variety within a region. And then these networks can actually be much larger. They can be between regions, the Northeast and the Southwest. So they can actually go all across the country. And as some of you get more and more interested in seed saving, you may want to participate in some of these networks. So some other considerations for planning, and this really gets into one of the main reasons that Bill went over, that seed saving is important and is really the focus of my work, is bioregional adaptation and bioregional variety development. So Bill and I work on adapting existing varieties to our bioregion, but we are also working on creating entirely new varieties that are adapted to our region. And so you want to have an idea about um, your weather, right? The variation in your weather. This was a set of data I pulled off the internet in the middle of February. And, these are all Massachusetts locations and not all that far away from each other. And you can see the weather that day was pretty variable between just these four locations. And it's even more variable the further away, the wider a geographic area that you're talking about. And this is the colors just show you that these are weather variability. There's variability in rainfall and temperature and all of those things. And then you have climate. And climate it's a seasonal characterization of the weather patterns in where you live or where, across the world. And in New England, we have several different climates, and that gets really interesting. So if you look on the left-hand picture here of New England, and you look at Massachusetts, and it's kind of small in this picture, but you will see out on Cape Cod, there's at least two, if not three, totally different climates. And then the rest of Massachusetts has this pale green, this sort of aqua blue, and this like darker blue. So when we're breeding for a region, you're actually dealing with a variation in the climate, not just weather, but in the climate itself. And so Bill and I really work, we focus a lot on all of Massachusetts, but certainly in the region just to the north of Massachusetts and just to the south. And so we're looking at creating varieties or adapting varieties that do well across all of these different climates. And it gets very, very interesting. And so environment, this is important. You want to really be considering the environment where this seed is going to be grown and where the seed is going to be used. So the environment is the natural world, but it is also the social and the economic component of the system where you're growing this crop. And maybe that's not important if you're just trying to save seed for your personal use or for friends and family. But if you're trying to share this seed within your community, some of these social and economic factors really do come into play when you consider the environment where this seed is going to be used. And that is also a concept that we call the environment of intended use. And so you may or may not want to be considering that when you're planning on seed saving. But it is important to be aware of. And when you're conducting variety trials and you are evaluating the plants and whether or not they are doing things that you like, and we'll get a little bit more into what I mean by that, this concept of performance comes up, and you'll hear plant breeders talking about performance. And it's really just how well does the variety that you're looking at, how does it behave and respond to your environment? And how do you want that variety to behave? And then I just want to touch on adaptation and adaptability. So when we talk about bioregional adaptation, um, and we talk about even just maybe you want to improve a variety, you like a variety, but you want to make a couple improvements. You're actually changing that variety over time. And in that sense, you will hear Bill and I say this all the time. To save seeds means you're actually playing the role of a plant breeder to a certain degree or not. And that means that you are helping steward that plant changing and adapting to your environment. And so you can adapt really, really specifically. Maybe you are only wanting to save seed. You live on outer Cape Cod and you're only looking at adapting a certain variety to grow just in your Eastham, Massachusetts location. It's a very, very specific set of adaptation. And oftentimes that is a much more narrow genetic diversity within the seed that you're saving. Or you can look at wider adaptation and the type of work that Bill and I are doing, working all across Massachusetts and all of those different climate types. We're actually looking for plants that can perform well in Cape Cod and in Southeast Mass and in Western Massachusetts. And so those plants need to have the ability to respond to those different climates and those different weather patterns and those different environments. And so that's wide adaptation. And generally, thinking about a wider, broader adaptation, you have more resilient genetics, and it comes into play adaptability. So adaptability is the ability of a certain variety to grow well in different environments. And so, and we will be talking a lot more about this. This is just introducing this comment, and you're going to hear a lot more about it throughout the summer. And then region. So talking about the region. So across the United States, we have lots of different regions, and within one region, we have subregions. So thinking about all of those things as you plan your variety trials and planning to save seeds. So there's lots of reasons to conduct variety trials. Um, It can be long-term risk management if you're a farmer and you only grow one type of carrot and you have some weird climate disruption or environmental disruption. All of a sudden you lose that one carrot because it couldn't handle it. You might have had better luck if you were growing 4 or 5 different types of carrots, and maybe 3 or 4 of them would have made it through that. Um, Conducting variety trials allows you to understand how different varieties perform in your environment. If you're certified organic, it helps you um, maintain your organic certification by um, evaluating different varieties that and seed organic certified seed that you can grow. You might want to, as you really got into seed saving, you may want to actually start your own plant breeding project. And, maybe you really are trying to save seed in order to improve an existing variety. You want to know what you're starting with to begin with, and a variety trial can tell you that. Sometimes you're just curious. You see a new variety and you've never heard of it before, and you want to see how it does in comparison to the varieties of a certain crop that you're already familiar with. And so, the level of work that Bill and I are trying to do, we're really looking at strengthening our food system resiliency. So, evaluating varieties that exist is really important in providing information to our farmers and producers, so that they know, we did a variety trial, we conducted it for 3 years, and we looked at 15 different varieties of cauliflower. And these are the 3 varieties that we found that do really, really well. And that information can actually help our farming community in selecting varieties to purchase from a seed catalog. So there's a lot of different reasons to conduct um, variety trials. And there's a lot of really interesting statistics about food security and food insecurity. And I think we are all um, familiar with those. And this lack of biodiversity and that crash in biodiversity that Bill talked about last time, having lost almost 90% of the biodiversity in the crop types that are available to people over the past 100 years. That's a really sobering statistic. And just a simple tenet of general ecology is that any system is less stable the less diversity and biodiversity it has in it. So the less diversity we have in our food system, the more susceptible and sensitive it is to crashing and disruption and not functioning the way we need it to. So whatever your reasons are for trialing, write those down in your notebook beside all of your crop specific um, considerations that we talked about. So Elena, how are we doing on time?
We have 5 minutes.
Okay. I'm wondering if people want to ask questions or if I should try to go through a few more of these slides.
Anybody have any questions? I guess we can keep going for a few minutes if you want.
Okay. All right. So one thing I want to talk about is determining what traits that you're looking for when you're growing your plants. Um, and traits can be anything from whether or not it is you have seed that germinates in cold early spring soil. Another, type of trait is how much does this variety require from me? In a farming system where we are used to using a lot of supports and um, some crop varieties need a lot of irrigation and they need a lot of fertilizer and they, might be susceptible to insect pressure. And so some varieties need a lot of inputs that can be expensive, time consuming to apply. And so maybe you're looking for a trait where this plant just doesn't require as many inputs. You want something that's tough and grows well and produces and doesn't require a lot of your time and money. And so really prioritizing a list of traits, and this is critical for seed saving, is what are the traits that you're looking at? Planting the trial itself, that can, you know, you want to take into consideration um, how far apart you want to be keeping these plants, how many of these varieties you actually want to look at side by side. Um, and, are there other farms or homes or homesteads that are going to be involved in this? You want to make sure everybody has the same starting point, the same seeds to plant for these variety trials. And you want to have a good understanding of your environment and just like you're planning a good garden for the year. Um, you should take into account who the end user of these plants and seeds are. And if possible, you should incorporate um, some of their desires for what these plants should do into your plan. So this is just an example. We grow chicory. We want to look for cold hardiness, whether it can overwinter, is it disease resistant? And then we also want to look, for uniformity of regrowth in the spring. And, is that going to give farmers a really nice early spring crop of chicory? Um, for tomatoes, we look at disease resistance. Um, we look at seedling vigor, how fast the transplants establish in the field, and the overall productivity. We also look at flavor. And so flavor is something that you are going to make observations of and take note of as you're looking at the different varieties. One way to set goals is to look back over your notes from the past year, review your crop plans, and review any notes you were able to take during the season. And especially when it comes to whether you've already grown different varieties. And, maybe you've grown the same variety of you know, eggplant on your farm for 3 or 4 years because you saw it at another farm and it looked great. And maybe after 2 years or 3 years, that variety never does well on your farm. Make note of that. It might not, your farm environment could be different than where you saw it growing. And, it may not be something that you really want to grow. I also, when I'm considering different crops and different varieties, I look for crops where the seed is getting really expensive. It may not be available organically, or it might be a market where the seed that is available is dominated by the F1 hybrids. And maybe I want to look for varieties that the seed that I'm sourcing is neither of those things. How are we doing, Elena?
Oh, it's 3 o'clock. Looks like we have a question maybe.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I'm wondering, in talking about the hybrids and a lot of seeds that are made, that will not, even if they had once been meant to flower and propagate, no longer can. And I'm wondering, sometimes I'll bring something home and it will come up the next year, even though it's not supposed to. And I might like to have those seeds uh, continue on. Can you reverse some of that carefully over time? Thanks. And
Yeah.
thanks for everything you're talking about. Thank
Oh,
you.
you're welcome. And, this is just, we've got a whole series of workshops coming up where we'll just keep expanding on everything we're talking about. But yes, sometimes the most unexpected things happen. And the best thing you can do is save those seeds. And it may take several years of growing those seeds out and adhering very carefully to what it is that you really loved about that plant and getting back to it. When we were talking about, yes, you can grow seeds from an F1 hybrid, you absolutely can. The first few years of doing that, you have to grow a lot, as many of those plants as you can. And then you really have to be very careful to save seeds from the plants that really are closest to what it was that you remember and that you want. And then over, after about 4 years of saving seeds from an F1 hybrid, you're going to start to see the populations that you grow from those seeds becoming more uniform and more true to the variety that you want and the traits that you want. Those are really interesting projects, and we can talk a lot more about that kind of approach to seed saving, which is really, in that sense, becomes a plant breeding project.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Um, awesome. Okay. Well, I think we'll wrap things up for today then. Hannah, thank you so much. That was so interesting.
Yeah.
Really, yeah, looking forward to the next one. Um, Great. Yeah, well, I'm gonna post this online as soon as I can, and we'll see everybody in July.
Yeah, and
Thank you so much.
you're welcome. Looking forward to it.
All right, have a great day, everybody.
Thank you again. Bye.